Close your eyes. Hear the distant hooves upon a dusty road. Feel the warmth of a fading sun and drift into a quieter chapter of Westeros. A hedge knight, a hidden prince, a land scarred by past rebellions, where even a dispute over water can awaken echoes of blood and fire. Tonight's tale, The Sworn Knight. Late summer in the Reach had a way of pretending to be generous. The fields rolled away in long swells of gold, wheat and barley bending under their own ripeness, bright enough to hurt the eyes at midday. From a distance, it looked as though the land were rich beyond measure. Only when a man rode through it did he begin to see the truth. Stalks too dry at the root, earth splitting into pale cracks beneath the surface, and wells sunk lower each passing week. Sir Duncan the Tall rode at an easy pace along a dusty track bordered by brittle grass. His shield, bearing the simple elm tree he had chosen for himself, hung at his saddle. The paint had begun to chip in places. He meant to mend it when coin allowed. Beside him walked Egg, leading their spare palfrey by the reins. The boy's head was bare to the sun, as always, smooth as a monk's tonsure. He had wrapped a faded cloth about his neck to keep from burning, though he complained of the heat all the same. "It's too quiet," Egg said. Dunk glanced across the fields. Grasshoppers leapt in the weeds. A hawk circled high and slow. "It's the heat," he said. "Makes men quiet too." Egg sniffed. "I've heard louder summers." That Dunk could not argue with. Ahead of them, rising from a lay ridge, stood Standfast. It was not a castle in any grand sense. A tower, rather, squat and weathered, built of stone that had once been pale, but had long since browned under sun and rain. A crumbling wall ringed it, more suggestion than defense. A banner hung from a crooked pole above the battlements, its colors faded nearly to memory. The device upon it, a checky lion, could still be made out if one squinted and remembered what it had been meant to show. "Is that it?" Egg asked. "That's it." Egg studied the tower with frank disappointment. "It looks smaller than I thought." "Most things are," Dunk said. The road curved toward a dry ditch that had once been part of a moat. Now it was a trench of cracked mud scattered with stubborn weeds. A single wooden bridge crossed it, warped slightly in the middle. Two men-at-arms waited near the gate, if gate it could be called. One wore a helm too large for his head, the other none at all. Their spears were straight enough, though the leather of their grips was worn smooth. They watched Dunk approach with cautious curiosity. "Sir Duncan the Tall," Dunk called as he reined in. "Sworn sword." The larger of the two men squinted up at him. "To Sir Eustace?" he asked. "If he'll have me." The man spat into the dust and nodded toward the tower. "He's inside, been waiting on you." That last seemed unlikely, but Dunk did not say so. He ducked slightly as he passed beneath the low archway into the yard beyond. The air inside the walls felt no cooler. A stable stood to one side, its roof sagging. A single cow lay in the shade of the cower, ribs faintly visible beneath its hide. Egg's gaze took in everything at once, quick and sharp. "They've not much," he murmured. Dunk dismounted and handed his reins to the smaller guard. "We'll not have much either if we're turned away," he said quietly. The door to the tower opened before they could knock. Sir Eustace Osgrey stood framed in shadow. He was tall once, and might still have seemed so had he not grown thin and slightly bent with years. His beard was white and carefully combed. He wore a surcoat that had been mended many times but brushed clean. At his hip hung a sword of good steel, the hilt worn smooth with long use. His eyes were pale and sharp. "So," Sir Eustace said, voice dry as the fields beyond his walls, "you are the hedge knight." "I am," Dunk said, bowing his head slightly. "Sir Duncan the Tall." Eustace's gaze traveled up and up, measuring. "You are tall," he allowed. "That is something." He stepped aside without another word, and Dunk entered the tower. Inside, the air was dim and smelled faintly of old stone and dust. A narrow stair wound upward along the wall. A table stood near the hearth, though no fire burned. 2 chairs flanked it, one better kept than the other. Egg slipped in quietly behind Dunk and stood near the wall. Sir Eustace seated himself first. "You served before?" he asked. "Yes, my lord." "Under whom?" "Several. Most lately at Standfast's neighbor." Dunk paused a fraction. "Cold moat." A flicker passed across Eustace's face. Too quick to be called a flinch, too sharp to be called nothing. "Cold moat," he repeated. "Yes, my lord. And why are you not there now?" Her service ended. Eustace leaned back slowly in his chair. "Ended," he said. "A fine word. Things end often in the Reach. Rivers dry. Harvests fail. Alliances shift." His fingers tapped once against the table's surface. "I require a sworn sword," he said at last. "A man who knows which end of a spear to hold. A man who remembers what oaths mean." Dunk inclined his head again. "I know oaths, my lord. Do you?" Eustace's gaze sharpened. "Many speak them lightly." Dunk thought of other towers, other lords who had clung to pride while coin ran thin. He thought of the road, long and patient. "I do not," he said simply. Eustace studied him for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "You will have board and what coin I can spare. It is not much. The Reach has seen better summers." "That it has," Dunk agreed. Eustace's mouth tightened faintly at that, though whether in agreement or annoyance, Dunk could not say. "And the boy?" the old knight asked, glancing toward Egg. "My squire. He speaks when I cannot stop him." Eustace made a sound that might have been amusement. "He may remain," he said, "provided he remembers his place." Egg bowed stiffly, face smooth as ever. Outside, the afternoon wore on, heavy and unhurried. Dunk was shown to a narrow chamber above the yard. Its window looked out across the fields, where gold stretched to the horizon in brittle waves. From here, Standfast seemed almost grand in its loneliness, a tower holding its ground against a sea of harvest. He set his helm upon a stool and leaned against the window's edge. Far below, he could see Sir Eustace pacing slowly along the yard wall, one hand resting upon the stone, as if steadying himself against more than age. "What do you think?" Egg asked quietly. Dunk watched the old knight for a moment before answering. "He's proud," he said. "Pride doesn't fill wells." "No," Dunk agreed, "but it keeps men standing when they might sit." Egg considered that. "Cold Note had water," he said after a moment. "Yes, and Standfast does not." Dunk did not answer at once. From this height, he could see the dry line where a small stream had once cut between the lands. Now it was little more than a scar through cracked earth. He understood then that this service would not be simple. The Reach looked golden in late summer, but gold could be brittle, and when things grew brittle, men did as well. He rested his forearms upon the sill and let the heat press against him. Below, Sir Eustace stopped his pacing and looked out across his fields as if searching for rain in a cloudless sky. Standfast stood because it had always stood. Whether that would be enough was another matter entirely. Sir Eustace Osgrey carried his past the way other men carried swords, openly and with care. In the afternoons, when the sun pressed hardest upon the stones of Standfast and the yard lay emptied of motion, he would climb the wall walk with slow determination. From there, he could look out over the lands that had once been richer, broader, more certain of themselves. The field still rolled in gold beneath late summer light, but it was a thin gold now, dry at the root and brittle to the touch. What had once promised abundance now suggested exhaustion. The tower itself bore the same truth. Standfast had not been built to impress. It had been built to endure. Thick walls, narrow windows, stout stones laid by men who believed their blood would hold this ground for centuries. Time had kept its bargain. but not kindly. The mortar had begun to crumble in places. Lichen crawled along the lower stones. The banner above, once vivid in checky gold and green, had faded to something closer to memory than heraldry. Yet Eustace walked those walls as though he still commanded a host. He had been young once, beneath brighter banners. He had ridden beneath a different sky, one heavy with storm and promise, rather than heat and dust. In those days, the Reach had not seemed a place that could wither. Rivers had run deep. Harvests had come thick and sweet. The great houses had feasted without counting loaves, and he had ridden to war. The Blackfire Rebellion had carved itself into his memory more deeply than drought ever could, not because he had stood at the center of its turning, but because he had believed himself to stand there. In youth, belief carried a heat stronger than any summer. He had chosen his dragon. If it seemed then not rebellion, but rightful correction. The tales told in halls had favored one claim over another, and pride had done the rest. Young knights were seldom immune to the call of banners that promised restoration of lost glory. Eustace had not been immune either. He remembered the thunder of hooves on hard ground, the shimmer of spear points beneath morning sun, the weight of a helm pressing sweat to his brow. War at a distance had the appearance of purpose. Up close it had been noise and confusion, and men falling where they stood. He had not distinguished himself in legend. He had survived. That survival had become, in time, both burden and anchor. When the red dragon fell and the field stilled, the world did not end. It simply rearranged itself. Some men bent the knee and prospered, others bent and endured, and few did not bend at all. Eustace had bent enough to keep his lands, but not enough to forget. Standfast had paid quietly for his loyalties. Lands trimmed at the margins, rights reduced. The slow erosion of influence came not with sword point, but with parchment and seal. He had watched neighbors grow in strength while his own holdings thinned, like the stream that once ran full between his lands and those of Coldmoat. Where water had once divided fields cleanly, now only cracked earth marked the line. Memory, for Eustace, was not soft. It was structured. He remembered banners in exact color, the feel of reins in his gloved hand, the names of men who had ridden beside him and fallen nameless into mud. He remembered believing that the world could be remade by courage alone. Standfast had once hosted feasts where lords of the Reach shared wine beneath lantern light. Now, its hall held fewer chairs than it once had guests. The table bore marks of careful repair. The silver had been sold years ago, replaced by pewter, polished to shine as though pretending at nobility. Pride had survived where coin had not. The drought only sharpened what time had already begun. Wells that once filled without thought now required lowering the bucket twice, 3 times, to reach muddy water. Cattle grew lean in fields that should have fed them richly. The small folk worked longer hours beneath a sun that offered no mercy, and even then the earth yielded reluctantly. From the tower's height, Eustace could see how the land remembered its former shape. The faint depression where the stream had run remained visible even in dryness. The curve of orchards planted in more generous seasons still marked the slope beyond the ridge. The Reach did not forget what it had been. Neither did he. There were days when he stood upon the wall walk and imagined hearing distant horns. The mind, when fed on memory long enough, could almost conjure sound from silence. He would close his eyes and see again the press of armored men, the gleam of dragon sigils in motion. He would feel the old certainty that he rode for something greater than a single tower and its thinning fields. Then he would open his eyes to cracked earth and fading banners. Age had not softened him, but it had narrowed his world. Once he had ridden across leagues, now he measured distance by how far he could walk before needing to rest his hand upon stone. Yet even in narrowing, he remained convinced of his place within a larger order. Honor, to Eustace, was not abstraction. It was lineage carried forward in spite of loss. The Osgreys had been greater once. Songs had named them. Alliances had courted them. To accept their diminishment entirely would have meant conceding those songs had lied. He did not concede easily. The drought had given him a foe he could not ride against. Water obeyed no banner. Rivers did not bend to lineage. When the stream that once marked the boundary between Standfast and Coldmoat thinned to a trickle and then to memory, it did not ask permission. Yet in its absence, old grievances found fresh voice. Water, like honor, was a matter of rights. In seasons of abundance, boundaries mattered less. Streams ran wide enough for all. Fields grew thick enough that dispute could be delayed until cooler months. But when the land hardened and wells sank low, every measure of moisture became a claim. Eustace had stood upon his wall and watched the line of green shift slightly nearer to Coldmoat's side, year by year. What had once seemed shared bounty now looked like theft accomplished by patience. Memory sharpened such perceptions. He remembered a time when the Webbers of Coldmoat had courted Osgrey favor, when banners had dipped politely upon meeting at tourney grounds, when feasts had been shared without suspicion. That time felt as distant as the red dragon's fall. Heat did not create pride, but it dried out compromise. Standfast's tower cast a shorter shadow now than it had in spring. The sun stood nearly overhead at midday, offering little relief to stone or man. Eustace would descend at last from the wall walk, joints stiff, gaze lingering on the fields as though willing them to remember rain. Inside the hall, the air held stillness rather than coolness. Dust motes turned slowly in shafts of light. The past lingered in tapestries whose colors had dulled but not disappeared entirely. Scenes of hunts and battles adorned the walls, stitched in brighter seasons. He would sit beneath those faded threads and rest his hands upon the table that had once hosted lords. The reach remained beautiful in late summer, but beauty, he knew, could conceal fragility. Gold could be brittle, banners could fade, streams could vanish. What endured was not the abundance of the land, nor the favor of kings, but this stubborn belief that one's name still meant something. Sir Eustace Osgrey held to that belief as firmly as he once held a lance. Standfast stood because he stood, and though the fields lay dry beyond his walls, and though memory weighed heavier than mail ever had, he remained certain of one thing. A knight's worth was not measured by the depth of his well. It was measured by how long he refused to yield ground. By the third week of service, Sir Duncan the Tall learned the sounds of Standfast and drought. They were not loud sounds. They were the scrape of empty buckets against stone, the low, irritated bawl of cattle denied their fill, the steady rasp of sickles cutting grain that had ripened too quickly beneath relentless sun. Even the wind, when it came, moved through the fields with a dry whisper rather than a sigh. Late summer had gilded the reach in color, but robbed it of softness. From the tower's height, the fields appeared full enough, heavy with heads of wheat, bending toward harvest. Yet when small folk walked among them, the earth cracked beneath their boots. Roots clung shallow in soil hardened like fired clay. What should have been plump and yielding felt instead brittle in the hand. The wells told the truer story. Once, Standfast's well had been deep and generous. It had served men, beasts, and fields without complaint. Now, the rope had grown longer, the bucket descending farther before striking muddy water. Each morning, the small folk gathered in patient line, speaking little as they waited their turn. The sound of a bucket touching the bottom carried a hollow note, as if echoing in an emptier place than before. Children had learned not to waste a drop. Where once they might have splashed or rinsed freely, now they cupped water carefully, drinking in silence before passing the bucket along. Mothers watched closely. The old remembered weather years and shook their heads without speaking of them. The cattle fared worse. Thin along the flanks, their ribs faintly visible beneath hide, they grazed in fields where grass grew sparse between patches of dust. The streams that had once cut across the land in lively ribbons had dwindled to narrow veins of sluggish water, and even those lay closer to Coldmoat's lands than to Standfast's. In the mornings, Dunk often walked the boundary where the old streambed lay. It was little more than a scar in the earth now, winding pale between stands of dry reeds. The depression remained visible, proof that water had once claimed that path with certainty. But its surface held only cracked mud and the occasional stagnant pool, clouded and still. The small folk crossed it freely, though not without glances toward the distant green of Coldmoat's orchards. On that side of the old line, the trees held more leaf, their fruits swelling slower but steadier. Water ran there still, thin but present. Standfast's people did not speak openly of envy. They spoke instead of fairness. Work began before the sun crested fully above the horizon. Men and women moved into the fields with tools worn smooth by years of handling. The wheat had to be cut before it shattered in the heat. Too dry, and it would crumble before it reached the threshing floor. Dust rose with every step. It clung to hems and beards alike, coating tongues until speech tasted of earth. By midday, the air shimmered above the fields, blurring the edges of distant trees and turning the tower of Standfast into a wavering shape against the sky. Dunk labored alongside them when he could. A sworn sword might wear steel at his hip, but in drought, even knights found reason to lift a scythe. His size made him useful. He could bind sheaves quickly, lift bundles others struggled with, shoulder sacks that might have required 2 men in better seasons. The small folk watched him at first with cautious curiosity. Knights were often distant figures, visible in armor, less so in sweat. But Dunk did not carry himself like a man above the labor. He bent as they bent. He wiped dust from his brow as they did. In the quiet rhythm of shared work, distance narrowed. Still, hunger crept closer by degrees. Meals at Standfast had grown simpler. Bread baked from grain mixed with older stores tasted coarser. The stew pot held more turnip and less meat. Even the cow in the yard gave thinner milk. The drought did not yet bring famine, but it whispered of its approach. At dusk, when the sun sank red and wide behind the fields, the sky often promised rain in color alone. Clouds gathered in pale streaks, then thinned to nothing as the air cooled without mercy. The smell of storm would tease the land briefly, only to fade into dust. Children began to look toward the horizon each evening with quiet hope. old men had taken to watching the sky as well, though their expressions carried less expectation. Water had become a measure of patience. In seasons past, standfast small folk had drawn from the stream without thought. Now they walked farther, carrying buckets toward what little flow remained near Coldmoat's edge. There, tension hung unspoken in the air. Webermen sometimes stood at a distance, not forbidding, but observing. Observation in dry seasons felt sharper in command. Dunk had seen enough of the world to know how such matters could turn. Water was life in the reach, but it was also leverage. The earth bore marks of strain everywhere he looked. Fence posts leaned where soil had loosened. Orchard trees shed leaves early to conserve what moisture remained. Even insects seemed fewer than usual. The steady drone of summer, once constant, had thinned to scattered bursts. The nights offered little relief. Heat lingered in stone and ground alike, rising back into the air after sunset. Windows stood open, but the breeze that entered carried warmth rather than coolness. Sleep came lightly and left quickly, yet the land remained beautiful. That was its quiet cruelty. Golden fields under a fading sun looked like prosperity. A tower on a ridge against a painted sky suggested permanence. The reach did not show its hardship easily. It disguised scarcity in color. Dunk often stood at the window of his narrow chamber and watched the last light settle over the dry streambed. He thought of other roads, other seasons. He had seen wars ruin in the riverlands, where fields lay burned and villages emptied by steel. This was different. No enemy had ridden through Standfast. No banners had fallen in flame. The land itself had tightened its fist. Below, the small folk gathered in the yard at night to share what little breeze might pass between stones. They spoke softly of weather signs, of clouds shaped like mares or towers, of distant rumors that rain had fallen 2 days' ride west. Rumor was a fim comfort. Ser Eustace walked among them at times, his steps slower, but his bearing unbent. He inspected the fields, nodded at sheaves bound neatly, his stewards over measures and stores. Pride required vigilance, even in drought. The small folk bowed their heads as he passed, though their eyes sometimes strayed towards the horizon, where Coldmoat's green seemed a shade deeper. Dunk saw it all. He saw how scarcity sharpened memory. Men recalled old slights more readily when wells ran low. Boundaries felt narrower when streams thinned. Pride stiffened where compromise might once have flowed. The Reach had always been a land of plenty. In plenty, grievances could be postponed. In drought, they ripened quickly. By the end of the 3rd week, the earth had hardened further. The well rope bore fresh wear from its lengthening descent. The cattle shadows looked thinner at noon. Still, no rain came. The sky remained broad and pitilessly clear. Standfast endured, but endurance, Dunk knew, was not the same as strength. And as the fields dried and the streambed cracked, he began to understand that the truest test of a sworn sword would not come in bright armor upon a field, but in how a knight chose to stand when the land itself offered no mercy. Unease did not come to Sir Duncan all at once. It gathered in small moments, like dust along a windowsill. He first felt it along the dry streambed. The boundary between Standfast and Coldmoat had once been simple. Water ran there, clear and unarguable. Men might dispute stones or trees, but a flowing stream drew its own line. Now the water had withdrawn, leaving only cracked mud and a shallow channel, winding pale through reeds. Dunk walked it often. He told himself it was a knight's duty, to know the ground he might be called to defend. Yet the land did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like something unfinished, as if waiting for men to give it shape again. On Coldmoot's side, the green lingered longer. The orchards there held more leaf. Their fruit, though smaller than in wetter summers, still swelled on the branch. A narrow ribbon of water moved through a cut in the earth, guided by careful hands. It was not a river, but it was enough. Standfast's side looked thinner by comparison. The difference was not vast. A stranger might have missed it. But to those who worked the soil, it was clear as a banner in sunlight. Men from Coldmoot began appearing more often near the boundary. They did not cross. They did not shout. They stood at a distance and watched as Standfast's small folk filled buckets from the last lingering pools. Sometimes they spoke among themselves and turned away. Sometimes they lingered longer than courtesy required. Observation, Dunk had learned, could carry more weight than threat. He noticed it in the way the small folk moved when watched. Shoulders stiffened, backs straightened. Words grew shorter. The air between lands felt charged without sound. Sir Eustace did not ignore it. He rode out one morning in mail that had been polished carefully despite its age. His helm gleamed faintly beneath the sun. He did not ride far, only to the edge of the dry channel. But he rode with deliberate visibility. Dunk rode beside him. The old knight sat tall in the saddle, as if drought had not narrowed his holdings, as if memory alone could widen the stream bed again. The banner of Osgrey fluttered from a lance carried by one of the men-at-arms, its colors faded but unmistakable. Coldmoot's men stood across the channel, their own devices crisp and bright by comparison. No words were exchanged across that distance. None were needed. Dunk felt the weight of it in his chest. Water had become more than necessity. It had become accusation. That evening, as the sun bled red along the horizon, Dunk sat upon the low wall of the yard and watched the cattle nose at empty troughs. He understood oaths. He had sworn to Sir Eustace freely enough. Board, coin, and the promise of honest service were not small things for a hedge knight. Yet service did not always align with sense. The land itself seemed to argue for compromise. Fields did not care for heraldry. Wells did not deepen out of pride. If Coldmoot's stream had been diverted by careful digging and old rites, then perhaps there had been reason once. But reason grew brittle in drought. Dunk had seen feuds born of less, a stolen sheep, a cut tree, a slight at table. Here, the cause was water. And water, in the reach was life, measured in bushels and calves and winter stores. The small folk felt it most sharply. When Coldmoot's riders passed near the boundary, children were called indoors. Women watched from doorways. Men stood straighter, tools held not as weapons, but as symbols of possession. The unease deepened when word reached Standfast that Coldmoot had reinforced its small dam upstream. It was said to be only maintenance, a strengthening of banks against further loss. Yet the effect was played enough. The thin trickle that once reached Standfast fields slowed further, then stilled entirely. The dry channel became truly dry. Dunk walked its length that afternoon, boots stirring powder from cracked mud. He could trace where water had once curved naturally. He could see where hands had guided it elsewhere. He crouched near the boundary stone and ran a gloved finger along its worn surface. Boundaries endured longer than streams. Behind him, the field of Standfast lay exposed beneath a sky that offered no relief. He thought of the old wars Sir Eustace remembered so vividly. Those battles had been fought over crowns and claims, dragons red and black, banners raised for visions of rightful rule. This was smaller, And yet, to the people who labored here, it was everything. That night, a cart belonging to Standfast was found overturned near the boundary. No blood marked the ground, no bodies lay nearby, only spilled grain scattered across dust, and the cart's wheel cracked where it had struck stone. The men who had driven it returned on foot, shaken and tight-lipped. They claimed their horse had bolted at sudden movement from the reeds. They did not say whose movement. Coldmoat denied knowledge. Standfast did not believe the denial. Dunk listened as reports filtered through the yard, carried in fragments and retold in quieter tones. He had hoped this service might be simple. Guard a tower, patrol a field, keep bandits from testing thin walls. Instead, he felt the slow tightening of something less clear and more dangerous. Feuds rarely announced themselves as wars. They began with glances, with watched wells, with overturned carts and the suspicion of hands unseen. Sir Eustace's pride had been sharpened by memory. Coldmoat's authority had been strengthened by water. Between them lay a dry scar in the earth and a sworn sword who understood that steel might soon be asked to answer a question better settled by rain. Dunk did not fear battle. He feared misjudgment. An oath bound him to stand fast. It did not blind him to consequence. If swords were drawn over a stream that no longer flowed, small folk would bleed before knights did. The reach glowed golden beneath the setting sun, beautiful and unforgiving. Dunk remained upon the yard wall long after darkness fell, listening to the restless shifting of cattle and the distant cry of night birds. No rain came, only the steady knowledge that the drought had thinned more than wells. It had thinned patience, and patience, once gone, was harder to restore than water to a dry bed. The first open sign came not with banners, but with horses. 3 riders from Coldmoat appeared at mid-morning, their mounts well-kept and watered. They rode slowly along the boundary where the dry stream once marked division, not crossing into Standfast's fields, but close enough that dust from their passage drifted across the cracked bed. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply rode the line as if measuring it. Dunk watched from a rise near the fields, where wheat had already been cut and bound in careful stacks. The sun stood high and pitiless above them, pressing heat into helm and skin alike. He had left his shield at the tower that morning, expecting only labor, not spectacle. The riders wore Coldmoat's colors clearly. Their cloaks were newer than anything at Standfast, their bridles well oiled. Their horses held flesh where Standfast's cattle did not. One of the riders dismounted near the shallow trench where the stream had once flowed freely. He crouched and pressed his palm to the dry earth as if inspecting the quality of soil. Then he rose and drove a small wooden stake into the ground. It was done without flourish. The act itself was simple. The meaning was not. Dunk felt the shift ripple outward, even before the news carried back to the tower. Small folk working nearby straightened slowly, sickles lowering to their sides. A woman paused mid-step, with a bundle of sheaves balanced against her hip. The fields grew quieter, without anyone calling for silence. The lighter remounted. The 3 of them continued along the boundary for another 100 paces, placing 2 more stakes at measured intervals before turning back toward Coldmoat. They never crossed the dry channel. I did not need to. By the time Dunk returned to Standfast's yard, word had outrun him. Sir Eustace stood beneath the faded banner, mail already fastened, sword buckled at his side. His face bore no visible surprise. He had expected this. Men-at-arms gathered in loose formation near the gate, their numbers modest but attentive. Spears had been brought down from hooks along the wall. Helmets were adjusted with care. The yard felt smaller than it had before. Dunk did not speak. He saw in Sir Eustace's posture the echo of older fields and louder wars. Pride stiffened the old knight's spine as surely as youth once had. Within the hour, Standfast rode out. Not in force, for there was little force to muster, but with intent. The faded banner was raised. The men-at-arms formed a narrow line behind their lord. Dunk rode at Eustace's right, silent and watchful. The sun glared off metal as they approached the newly placed stakes. Coldmoat's riders had not remained. The three markers stood alone in the dry earth. Eustace reined in before the first. The stake bore no carving, no sigil. Plain wood, driven firmly into soil that had not known moisture in weeks. The message lay not in words, but in placement. Dunk could trace the imagined line between the stakes and see how it curved slightly inward toward Standfast's side. It was not a bold encroachment. It was subtle, measured. Eustace dismounted without assistance. Age had stiffened his movements, but pride lent them steadiness. He walked to the nearest stake and gripped it firmly. For a moment he stood motionless, hand resting on wood. Then he pulled. The stake resisted briefly before coming free with a brittle crack. He cast it aside into the dust. A second followed, the third as well. No cheers rose from Standfast's men. There was no need. The act itself was answer enough. Dunk felt the heat of it settle into his chest. Not triumph, not yet, but inevitability. This was how feuds deepened. One mark answered by another. One gesture returned in kind. They rode back to Standfast in silence. That evening, smoke rose on the horizon beyond Coldmoat's orchards. Not wildfire, but signal. A thin column of dark against the pale sky. Within hours, Coldmoat's riders returned. This time, they did not place stakes. They stopped openly at the boundary and waited. Standfast's men gathered again, forming a line across from them, separated by the dry scar of earth that had once been a stream. No swords were drawn. None needed to be. The distance between the two lines was narrow enough that faces could be seen clearly. Dust clung to boots and cloaks alike. The drought had stripped the land of softness. Now it stripped men of pretense. Dunk's gaze moved along Coldmoat's riders. They were not bandits. They were not reckless youths spoiling for glory. They were disciplined men, steady in saddle and posture. Behind them, at greater distance, more riders waited. Standfast did not have such depth. The sun lowered slowly, stretching shadows across the cracked bed between them. No herald stepped forward. No words carried across. The confrontation lay in stillness. Dunk felt it in his bones. Water had become line. Line had become claim. Claim would become clash if neither side yielded. A gust of wind stirred at last, carrying dust across both ranks alike. It stung eyes and throats without favor. The standoff lingered until the light thinned. Then, as if by silent agreement, Coldmoat's riders turned and withdrew once more. Standfast held its ground, but holding ground did not refill wells. That night, the yard at Standfast felt smaller still. Men-at-arms checked straps and counted arrows by lantern light. Horses were watered carefully from buckets drawn with greater effort than ever. The cow in the yard shifted restlessly, ribs stark beneath moonlight. Dunk stood along the wall walk beside Sir Eustace. The old knight looked across the dark fields toward the unseen orchards of Coldmoat. The land between them lay quiet now, but it was a quiet like the moment before thunder. A pause heavy with stored heat. Dunk understood then that the drought had ceased to be merely hardship. It had become contest, not of swords yet, but of resolve. And resolve, like water, could be diverted. The dry stream bed lay pale beneath moonlight, its cracked surface reflecting faint silver. It looked almost peaceful from a distance. Dunk knew better. Where water once ran freely, now men stood in opposition. And though no blood had yet stained the earth, the line in the dust had been drawn. The event came at dawn, when light was weakest and tempers shortest. Dunk was already awake when the shouting began. It rose from the direction of the dry stream bed, first a single voice, then several, sharp and urgent. Not the cry of alarm that follows steel, but the rough-edged call of men discovering something undone. He was on his feet before the second shout carried to the tower. By the time he reached the yard, Sir Eustace was already mounted. No orders were spoken in the open air. None were required. The men-at-arms gathered in quiet haste, fastening straps, lifting spears. Dust rose beneath hooves as they rode toward the boundary. The sun had barely cleared the horizon. Mist clung low in shallow pockets along the dry channel, not from abundance, but from the faint cool of night retreating. When they reached the boundary, the change was plain. Coldmoat's small dam, carefully raised upstream to hold what little water remained, had been broken. The earthen bank lay collapsed inward, stones displaced, wooden supports torn loose and scattered along the bed. What water had gathered behind it now seeped outward in muddy trickles, spreading thin and wasted across cracked ground before sinking uselessly away. It was not flood. It was not sabotage designed for spectacle. It was a wound made deliberately and without noise. Coldmoat's riders were already there. They stood on their side of the channel, inspecting the damage. More of them than before. And this time, their posture held no patience. Dunk dismounted beside the broken bank and crouched to study it. The cuts in the wood were clean, not the work of erosion. Steel had done this recently. The earth was still soft where the supports had been pried loose. The silence between the two sides felt heavier than any shouted accusation. No man stepped forward to claim the act. No banner was raised. The deed itself spoke loudly enough. Standfast's small folk gathered at a distance, watching with faces drawn tight. For them, the dam had meant the difference between parched fields and modest survival. Now even that thin promise had been scattered into dust. Dunk rose slowly. He felt eyes upon him from both sides. He wore Standfast's colors at his shoulder now. He rode at Sir Eustace's right. In the language of fields and feuds, that placed him plainly. He looked along the broken bank and then across to Coldmoat's riders. He did not see guilt written on their faces. He saw certainty. They believed the act had been done by Standfast. Whether it had or not mattered less than belief. The first stone flew before anyone could call it back. It arced from the rear of Coldmoat's gathered small folk, thrown by hand rather than sling, and struck the dry bed near Standfast's men with a dull thud. Not aimed at flesh. A signal, another followed. Then another. Standfast's small folk answered in kind. Within heartbeats, the air between them filled with small, bitter arcs of thrown earth and stone. No steel drawn, no charge given, but the line had shifted from posture to action. Dunk moved without thought. He stepped forward into the dry channel itself, raising both arms. He did not shout. He stood, large enough to command sight even without command of voice. A stone struck his shoulder and glanced off mail. Another struck his shield where it hung at his back. He did not flinch. He planted his boots in the cracked earth and remained there. The throwing faltered, not because men lacked anger, but because the target stood not as foe, but as reminder. Steel, once drawn, could not be easily sheathed. Dunk's gaze swept both sides in turn. Standfast men held spears now, grips tightening. Coldmove's riders sat ready, horses restless beneath them. The broken dam lay between them like an accusation. The drought had thinned water. Now it thinned restraint. Dunk stepped closer to the shattered bank and crouched once more. He lifted one of the severed supports and examined its cut. The blade had been sharp, the angle clean. It could have been done by any man who knew how to swing an axe, which meant the blame could travel anywhere it was directed. He stood again and faced both sides. He did not belong fully to either house. That was his burden and his advantage. He raised one gauntleted hand and drove the broken support into the dry earth upright between them, not as claim, as marker. Then he stepped back towards Standfast line. The message was simple enough. The dam could be rebuilt. The channel could be repaired. But not with stones thrown and steel drawn. The silence stretched long. Finally, one of Coldmote's riders dismounted and approached the broken bank from his side. He examined the damage much as Dunk had done. Then he drove his heel against a loose stone and nudged it back into place. A small act, measured. Standfast men did not move at first. Then one of them stepped forward with a shovel and began pushing earth back toward the channel. No cheer rose, no reconciliation declared, but the throwing ceased. Men who had stood on opposite banks now knelt on either side of the same scar, hands moving dirt back into place, beneath a sun that offered neither mercy nor approval. Dunk remained standing until the first trickle of redirected water began to pool once more behind the rough shape of the restored dam. It would not hold long, not without fuller repair, but it held enough. When he finally stepped back towards Standfast line, dust clung to his boots and mail alike. He had placed himself plainly in the center, not by oath alone, but by necessity. The drought had drawn a line. The broken dam had forced a choice, and Dunk had chosen neither retreat nor charge, only ground. The fields beyond remained dry. The sky above remained pitilessly clear. But for the moment, steel remained sheathed, and that, in a season like this, was no small victory. By evening, the dam stood in rough repair. Water pooled shallowly behind the rebuilt bank, thin as broth but present. It would not last long unless tended, yet it was enough to quiet the immediate hunger in men's eyes. Standfast small folk returned to their fields in silence. Coldmote's riders withdrew without salute. No blood had been spilled, and yet something had shifted. Sir Eustace felt it before any other. He rode back to the tower without looking at Dunk. The yard of Standfast seemed smaller than before, its stones reflecting the last of the sun in dull gold. Men dismounted quietly. Spears were returned to their hooks. Horses were led away to be watered from buckets drawn with care. Dunk removed his helm and set it upon the bench beside the stable door. He felt no triumph. The day had been a narrow thing, a line walked carefully between escalation and reprieve. The broken dam had been restored by uneasy cooperation, not trust. But when he turned toward the tower entrance, He saw Sir Eustace standing beneath, the faded banner still mounted. The old knight's posture was rigid, not with fatigue, with offense. He dismounted stiffly and handed his reins to a groom without speaking. His gaze rested upon Dunk for a long moment, measuring, not in height this time, but in standing. Within the hall, the air felt closer than usual. Dust hung unmoving in shafts of evening light. The long table bore fresh marks where hands had pressed during heated retellings of the morning's events. Eustace stood at the far end of the room, hands resting upon the back of his chair. His pride had survived war, loss, and years of dwindling influence. But what had happened that morning had not been his command. The men had watched Dunk step into the channel. They had seen him halt the stones with presence rather than order. They had seen Coldmoat's rider answer his action. The dam had been rebuilt beneath his quiet authority. It was a subtle thing, but in a small holding like Standfast, subtle shifts mattered. Eustace had ridden out prepared for confrontation, perhaps even for a measured clash that would prove resolve. He had expected to stand at the center of that moment. Instead, the center had shifted to the hedge knight at his side. In youth, Eustace might have called it cleverness. In age, it felt like displacement. He walked slowly to the narrow window overlooking the fields. The land beyond lay unchanged, dry and golden, indifferent to the pride of men. The drought had reduced his holdings. It had forced him to watch Coldmoat grow greener by degrees. It had reminded him daily of diminished reach. Now, even within his own yard, authority felt less certain. Not lost, but shared. He had taken Dunk into service because a sworn sword added strength to thin walls, because height and steel could deter where numbers could not, because a hedge knight brought independence, not bound to reach rivalries. He had not taken him to lead, yet leadership did not always announce itself. Dunk's act had not been defiance, it had been prevention. Still, prevention could appear as presumption. Eustace's gaze drifted to the old tapestry hanging along the far wall, the one depicting a long-ago battle beneath a red dragon's wing. The thread had faded to rust. The dragon's eye no longer gleamed as once it had. He had once ridden believing he shaped events. Now events seemed to shape him. The broken dam had not been a matter of chivalric combat. It had been common necessity. Peasants throwing stones over water was not the stuff of songs. But songs had once been enough to carry a name forward. Now, names endured only if enforced. In the yard below, Dunk moved among the men, inspecting the repaired tools, speaking quietly, with the steward about shoring the dam properly before nightfall. He did not carry himself like a usurper. He carried himself like a man who knew work remained. That practicality stung. Eustace had grown accustomed to memory as measure. He remembered feasts, battles, alliances. He remembered riding at the flank of greater men. Dunk remembered thirst. The difference lay not in courage, but in vantage. As night settled over Standfast, torches were lit along the inner wall. Their flames burned steady in air that offered no breeze. Eustace descended the tower steps slowly and walked the yard's perimeter alone. Men straightened when he passed. They still bowed their heads. His authority had not vanished, but he sensed their glances shifting, calculating the balance between old lord and new strength. Pride could not be measured in bushels, yet bushels fed men more reliably than pride. At the restored dam, lantern light glimmered faintly as two of Standfast's small folk worked to reinforce the earthen bank with stone and timber. Dunk stood nearby, directing placement with gestures rather than command. Coldmoat's side lay dark. The land between them held its uneasy quiet. Eustace watched from a distance. He could have ordered Dunk to stand aside that morning. He could have declared the dam a matter for knights alone. Instead, he had watched. Age had taught him caution, but caution sometimes looked like surrender. The drought had stripped away the excess. What remained at Standfast was stone, thin water, and men. And among those men now stood one taller than the rest, not by lineage, but by presence. Eustace did not resent Dunk as enemy. He resented the reminder that time had shifted the world beyond his command. The tower's shadow stretched long across the yard beneath the rising moon. Standfast endured. It had endured loss before, but endurance required adaptation, and adaptation, for a man built on memory, could feel like erosion. Eustace stood until the lantern at the dam flickered low. He watched Dunk return to the yard at last, shoulders dusted with earth, helm tucked beneath his arm. The hedge knight looked tired. So did the old lion, the difference lay not in strength, but in season. And as late summer pressed on without rain, even lions learned that some battles were fought not with charge, but with quiet concession. Cold Moat did not answer with steel. It answered with parchment. 3 days after the dam was broken and restored, a rider approached Standfast at a measured pace beneath a white banner trimmed in silver thread. He did not come armed for skirmish. His mail was light, his sword peace-bound at the hilt. He carried a sealed letter. The heat that day pressed down heavier than before. The sky had taken on a pale, washed quality, as though even blue had grown tired of enduring. Sir Eustace received the rider in the yard rather than the hall. It was a choice, and one not made without thought. Let the men see, let the fields witness. The letter bore Cold Moat's seal, clear wax impressed with a spider whose legs spread delicate and precise. The device was not faded. Its lines were sharp. The message within was brief and courteous. It acknowledged the damage to the dam and denied responsibility. It noted that water rights had long been recognized along certain channels, and that any attempt to redirect or interfere with Cold Moat's rightful holdings would be met with appeal to higher authority. It invited Sir Eustace to settle the matter formally before Lord and Law, rather than through misunderstanding between retainers. The language was polite, the implication unmistakable. Cold Moat would not contest Standfast in dust and stones. It would contest in courts and councils, and there the weight of lineage and influence would matter more than stubborn endurance. Sir Eustace read the letter twice before folding it carefully. His expression did not change, but the yard seemed to tighten around him. Appeal to higher authority meant drawing eyes beyond the dry stream bed. It meant attention, and attention, for a house diminished since the Blackfire days, carried risk. Standfast's claim to water rested partly on memory and partly on old arrangements, some written, some merely understood. Drought had made those understandings fragile. Cold Moat's orchards flourished because they had planned well, because they had diverted and dammed and maintained with foresight, because they had coin enough to do so. Eustace had pride, coin had thinned. The rider departed without incident, hooves raising little dust on his way back across the fields. By afternoon, word had spread among the small folk. Tort, law, judgment. Such words sounded distant and formal, but they translated into grain and hunger easily enough. If higher authority favored Coldmoat's claim, Standfast's access to water could shrink further. If it favored Osgray, Coldmoat would not forget. Dunk watched the reactions in silence. The men-at-arms spoke in low tones near the stable. The steward calculated stores beneath his breath. Women carrying buckets from the shallow pool glanced toward the tower as if expecting pronouncement. None came. Sir Eustace withdrew to the hall. The faded banners stirred faintly in a wind that carried no promise of rain. Dunk walked the boundary that evening as the sun descended behind the thinning clouds. The restored dam held, though only just. Water pooled shallowly, reflecting sky in dull shimmer. He imagined the matter carried beyond fields to greater halls, lords seated at long tables, considering maps rather than cracked earth. There, Coldmoat's influence would weigh heavy. Its orchards or fruit enough to gift, its coffers likely deeper. Standfast had history. History impressed men who valued songs, less so those who valued stability. The move was clever. By shifting contest from boundary to court, Coldmoat avoided direct clash while placing Standfast at disadvantage. Steel might favor a tall knight and stubborn lord. Parchment favored those with reach. Eustace knew it. That night, he summoned his steward and what few records Standfast possessed. Old charters were unrolled upon the long table, seals inspected, dates traced with fingers that had once traced battle maps. The parchments smelled faintly of age and smoke. Some bore marks from seasons past when ink had run under damp air. Others had edges frayed by handling. The claims they contained were real enough. But in matters of water and drought, clarity mattered more than tradition. Coldmoat's letter had been a statement not of innocence, but of confidence. They believed the court would favor them, or at least delay judgment long enough for drought to press Standfast further. Dunk remained apart from those discussions. He stood along the yard wall and watched as lantern light flickered within the hall. The political move felt colder than open hostility. It suggested patience, calculation. It implied that Coldmoat did not fear Standfast's steel. It feared only inconvenience. The following morning, riders departed Standfast, bearing Eustace's reply. The old knight had chosen to answer in kind. He would contest the claim formally. He would bring his charters and lineage to the same table. Pride demanded no less. The drought had narrowed fields, but it had not narrowed his will. Dunk understood the choice. He also understood its cost. If judgment favored Coldmoat, Standfast's access to water might be restricted entirely to what little the restored dam could gather. That would not sustain fields through another month of sun. If judgment favored Osgray, Coldmoat's resentment would deepen. There was no outcome untouched by consequence. The golden fields of the Reach lay silent beneath cloudless sky. They had borne witness to dragons and rebellions, to feasts and famines. Now they bore witness to parchment. Men could rebuild dams. They could not so easily rebuild standing, once eroded the Four Peters. As evening settled again, Dunk walked past the shallow well, where the rope now bore fresh wear. He looked toward the horizon, where Coldmoat's orchard glowed faintly green in dying light. The move had been made. The conflict had shifted ground once more, not from dust to steel, but from earth to ink. And in such contests, even a sworn sword might find his strength measured differently than he had expected. The drought remained. The sky offered no relief. Standfast stood, but now it stood not only against thirst, it stood before judgment. The turn came on a day when the sky looked almost kind. Thin clouds drifted in from the west, softening the sun and throwing a pale shade over the fields. Men glanced upward more often than they worked, because in late summer, a cloud could be a promise. Yet the air remained dry, and the wind carried no scent of rain. It carried only dust and a faint tang of smoke from distant hearths. At Standfast, preparations for the hearing had settled into routine. The steward had pulled every parchment from the tower's chest and laid them out in careful stacks. Grants, leases, old agreements written in crabbed hands and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Sir Eustace treated these papers as if they were banners. He handled them with a gentleness he did not always show to living men. The small folk watched from the yard, sensing that their fields now depended upon ink. Then the raven arrived. It circled the tower once and landed hard upon the battlements, black against pale stone. The bird's presence drew eyes the way a raised lance did, for ravens rarely brought comfort to poor towers. A man from the kitchen climbed the stair to fetch it, and when he descended, the message in his hand seemed heavier than the bird itself had been. The letter bore no spider seal, no cold moat wax. It carried the simple, blunt mark of a greater lord's household, pressed with authority that did not need ornament. The writing within was spare. It announced that the matter of water right between Standfast and Coldmoat had been noted. It declared that until a proper judgment could be rendered, no further alteration of dams or channels was to be attempted by either party. It demanded that both sides send representatives to a holding court, not at some minor sept or market town, but under the eye of higher power. It was not merely an invitation. It was a command. The drought had made water a private quarrel. Now the letter made it public. Sir Eustace read it in the hall, beneath his faded tapestry, and the sound of parchment shifting in his hands seemed loud in the stillness. His pride could argue with neighbors. It could not argue easily with the Reach's greater order, not without remembering how small Standfast had become. For Dunk, the raven's message carried another meaning. It meant delay. Holding courts did not gather overnight, and the roads were long. Men of greater rank moved slowly, like weather fronts. If judgment was postponed into weeks, the fields would not wait. Grain could be harvested without water, but animals could not live on dust, and men could not live on pride. The well rope would lengthen again. The thin pool behind a restored dam would shrink to mud. Law could decide the river's path. It could not summon rain. That would have been complication enough, but it was not the only turn. The same afternoon, a second messenger came, not by raven, but by horse, riding hard enough that sweat darkened his mount's neck. He did not carry a banner. He carried urgency. He brought word that Cold Moat had produced a charter older than any in Standfast's chest. It was said to be sealed with a Tyrell rose and witnessed by Septon and Lord, granting certain rights to draw from the stream in dry years, with lines described so precisely that even a stone could not pretend ignorance. The document, so rumor claimed, named Coldmoat's rights as prior and Standfast's as secondary, permitted only when water ran full. Rumor moved through towers the way wind moved through wheat, quickly and without asking leave. By sunset, even Standfast's small folk had heard some version of it, though none could read the words themselves. All they knew was that Coldmoat had parchment, and parchment had teeth. Sir Eustace responded as an old knight might when faced with a foe that would not meet him in the open. He turned back to his own records with renewed intensity, as if sheer effort could make the ink darker. The steward unrolled scroll after scroll, comparing dates, noting seals, tracing lines on maps drawn so crudely they might have been children's work. Dust rose from old leather bindings. Fingers grew black with soot where candles had burned too close. In that work, a small discovery emerged, quiet, almost accidental, like a stone turning underfoot. One of Standfast's most trusted parchments bore a seal that did not sit quite right. It was not an obvious flaw. The wax was the correct color for its age. The imprint showed the right device at a glance, yet the edges of the wax were too clean, as if pressed and then trimmed. And beneath it, the parchment showed a faint scar. A shadow or something else had once been affixed and later removed. A seal replaced. Not recently, not in the last week or month. Long ago, perhaps even before Sir Eustace's hair turned white, but replaced all the same. Such things happened in halls where men schemed, but in a poor tower like Standfast, it was rarer. It suggested that at some point someone had tried to strengthen Standfast's claim by craft rather than right. Dunk did not need to read the words to understand the danger. If Coldmoat brought a clean charter and Standfast brought one with a questionable seal, judgment would fall like an axe. Worse, it would not fall only on water rights. It would fall in honor. It would paint Sir Eustace not merely as stubborn, but as false. In the Reach, where lineage was weighed like grain, being proven dishonest could starve a house more surely than drought. The evening that followed was heavy with heat and quiet fear. Men spoke less in the yard. The cow's slow chewing sounded louder than conversation. The tower's stones held the day's warmth and gave it back grudgingly at night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a dog barked once and fell silent. Dunk walked the perimeter alone and watched the horizon. Clouds had thinned again. The pale promise of rain had faded to clear, hard sky. At the restored dam, the water level had dropped a finger's breadth since morning. The trickle that fed it from upstream looked weaker, not stronger. The earth around the bank had cracked anew, as though rejecting even that small concession. The turn, Dunk realized, was not a single thing. It was the shape of the conflict changing from neighborly feud into something broader and colder. Authority from above had taken notice. Parchment older and sharper had surfaced. And within Standfast's own history lay a bruise no one had wanted to press. A sworn sword could stand in a dry channel and stop stones with his body. He could not stop a seal from being questioned. He could not stop a holding court from delaying until thirst decided the matter for everyone. And yet the field still needed water. The small folk still needed certainty, even if certainty was bitter. In the yard, the small folk reacted the way thirsty men react to a changing sky, with watchfulness that tried to pass for patience. They did not speak of seals and charters. They spoke of shoulders rubbed raw by rope, of calves grown too thin, of seed grain tucked away against a winter that might punish them, no matter whose parchment prevailed. Children were kept closer to the tower, where shade could be found, and where, if need came, a bowl might be shared. Even the men-at-arms felt the shift. They sharpened spearheads that had little use against judges, checked tack and straps as if readiness were a kind of prayer, and stared toward the roads that led away from the fields they knew. Courts belonged to lords with banners bright enough to be seen for leagues. Standfast banner could barely be seen from its own yard. Dunk climbed the wall walk before sleep and looked out across the reach. The view was wide, but it offered no comfort. It only made plain how small Standfast was against the breadth of a lord's attention. His own place felt stranger as the dispute shifted from dust to ink. A sworn sword could stand in a channel and stop stones with his body. He could not stop a seal from being questioned. Yet his presence still mattered, if only as reminder that when water ran out, law would be tested by hunger. Soon someone would prove it. As night came, lanterns glowed along Standfast's wall, their light catching on the faded chequy lion above. The banner stirred faintly, almost as if trying to remember wind. Below it, Sir Eustace remained in the hall with his parchments, a lonely figure, surrounded by the brittle weapons of law. The old knight had once trusted lances and courage. Now he was forced to trust ink that might not even be his. The drought had begun as hardship. It had become contest. Now it was becoming judgment. And the worst part was the timing, the slow cruelty of it. The Reach would not wait for lords to decide what the earth had already begun to settle. The sky stayed clear. The wells stayed low. And the next move, Tung suspected, would not come from Cold Moat or Standfast at all, but from the larger powers drawn in by the raven's black wings. The rain did not come in time to save pride. It came in time to save the fields. Word from the holding court traveled slowly, borne by rider rather than raven. In the days between the turn of parchments and the arrival of judgment, Standfast endured beneath a sky that seemed carved from pale stone. Wells sank lower. The restored dam held only a shallow mirror of water that shrank by the hour. The cattle grew restless and thin. Sir Eustace prepared for judgment as a knight prepares for tourney, carefully, stubbornly, and with more ceremony than coin allowed. The questionable seal had been examined again and again beneath lamplight. No man within the tower could say when it had been replaced, or by whose hand. It had likely been done before Eustace had grown into a spurs, in some earlier season when Standfast had felt the first tightening of influence. The discovery sat between parchment and pride, like a blade laid flat upon a table. When the rider arrived at last, dust-coated and stiff from the road, he bore a message sealed cleanly and without ornament. The judgment was measured. Coldmoat's older charter was recognized as lawful. In seasons of drought, priority of flow lay with its orchards and fields. Standfast's rights were affirmed only when water ran sufficient for both. Yet there was Fenshire, too. The replacement seal in Standfast's records had been noted. No open accusation was written, but the implication was plain enough. The holding court advised that all charters be reviewed and reaffirmed by neutral hand to prevent further confusion. It was not humiliation, but neither was it victory. So Eustace received the letter in the hall beneath his faded tapestry. His hands did not tremble as he read. His face did not fall. He had known, perhaps from the moment the raven landed, that law would not favor memory over parchment. What struck him harder was not the loss of water and drought. It was the quiet stain upon record. Standfast would endure the season. It would tighten belts and count loaves and pray for autumn rain. But its name, already thinned by rebellion long past, would now carry a whisper of doubt in greater halls. Dunk stood in the yard when the news spread. There were no cries of outrage, no blades drawn in defiance. The small folk reacted as those accustomed to hardship do, with calculation. If cold moat held priority in drought, then Standfast must find another way to endure it. The restored dam would be left intact, but secondary. Wells would be deepened, if possible. Livestock culled early to preserve fodder. The work began that same afternoon. Pride, unlike wheat, could not be harvested. That evening, clouds gathered in the west once more. They had gathered before and broken apart into nothing. The sky had teased the Reach all summer with false promise. Yet as dusk deepened, the wind shifted. It carried scent, not dust, not smoke, but the faint, metallic breath of distant rain. Then paused mid-task to look upward. Children stood in the yard, faces lifted. The first drop struck the dry earth with a sound so soft it might have been imagined. Then another. Then a scatter, like seeds thrown lightly. The rain did not fall in a deluge. It came in steady, patient rhythm. The kind that soaked rather than battered. The kind that worked quietly into cracked soil and whispered of relief rather than spectacle. Within moments, the yard darkened with wet. The faded banner stirred more freely. Dunk stood still as rain ran down the curve of his helm and along the edge of his jaw. He did not smile broadly. He did not raise his arms. He simply breathed. The earth drank. The restored dam filled gradually, water rising behind its earthen bank. The dry stream bed darkened as rivulets found their old path once more. Coldmoat's orchards would benefit first and most. That was now settled by law, but the rain did not recognize charters. It fell across fields without prejudice. In the hall, Sir Eustace stood at the narrow window and watched the rain streak down stone. He had lost the contest in ink, but the land had answered in its own time. Rain did not erase judgment. It did not mend questioned seals. It did not restore lost grandeur. Yet it offered something more practical than vindication. It offered time. Time for wheat to swell again in future seasons. Time for wells to refill. Time for names to be spoken without hunger sharpening them. Standfast would not regain what it had been in youth. The black fire banners would not rise again. The feasts of old would not return to these walls in their former number. But the tower would stand. Its fields would green again in autumn. And its pride, though tempered, would not vanish entirely. The following morning dawned clear but cool. The earth smelled rich rather than brittle. Small pools glimmered where dust had lain. The cattle lifted their heads and drank without being driven. Dunk saddled his horse quietly. Egg waited beside him, cloak damp from the night's rain, face unreadable as ever. Service at Standfast had run its course. The judgment had fallen. The rain had come. The fields would endure another season. There was little more for a hedge knight to do. Sir Eustace stood in the yard as they prepared to depart. He bore himself as he always had, straight-backed, composed, white beard brushed clean. He did not look diminished. He looked older. Dunk bowed his head slightly. He had stood in the dry channel when stones flew. He had rebuilt the dam with men who might have been foes. He had watched pride bend but not break. Standfast had not won. It had not fallen. It had endured. A road south lay damp and dark, its dust turned briefly to mud. Dunk mounted and took the reins. Behind him, the faded banner of Osgrey lifted in the cool morning air, its colors softened by rain, but visible still. The reach stretched golden green beneath clearing sky. Drought had thinned men and land alike. Rain had reminded them both of patience. As Dunk and Egg rode away, the Tower of Standfast receded against the horizon, smaller than legend, but steadier than memory might suggest. Some battles were fought with lances and dragons, others with parchment and stubbornness, and some, most of all, were fought simply by remaining, through heat, through judgment, through the long wait for rain. If this quiet tale of the Reach eased your thoughts tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more calm journeys through Westeros.